If you've been working long enough, you've surely failed at something. And guess what? When it comes to interviews, there's no shame in failure. And yet, the failure question is the one I see candidates struggling with the most. In this video, I'll teach you how to answer the dreaded failure question. So next time you get asked, "Tell me about a time when you failed," you'll feel confident. Most candidates freeze up when I ask them about a failure, but I will teach you an approach to answering the failure question that always works, so you can confidently handle this question on your interview day. You are going to be so good at the failure question by the end of this video that you'll actually look forward to being asked, "Tell me about a time when you failed." Welcome to the Pocketboard channel, where accomplished industry mentors share their hard-earned lessons learned, guidance, and mentoring tips to help you navigate your current professional goals. My name is Erika, and I'm a former Google hiring manager who's been on the other side of the table at least 500, probably 1,000 times. Over time, I've learned what works and what doesn't work when it comes to answering all behavioral questions, including the failure question. I've mentored and interview prepped almost 100 people who have gone on to land their dream jobs at top-tier companies. Today, I'll teach you how to not only answer the failure question with confidence, but how to impress your interviewer and stand far apart from other candidates. In case you aren't familiar with behavioral interview questions, they are a type of interview question where the interviewer will ask you about your past experiences. Behavioral interview questions are designed to learn how you have responded to certain situations in the past and to get an idea of how you are likely to respond to similar situations in the future. There are 3 keys to acing a behavioral interview question. First, pick the right example. Second, be specific about what you did. Third, quantify your results. You can nail all of these keys by using a repeatable framework when answering any behavioral interview question, including the failure question. Behavioral interview questions are typically formatted something like, "Tell me about a time when," for example, "Tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker," or "Tell me about a time when you were overstretched with your workload." And every now and then, you may be asked, "Tell me about a time when you failed." If you want to ace the failure question, you need to demonstrate that you are a living, learning, self-improvement machine that will stop at nothing to be better tomorrow than you are today. I have a proven framework that I believe is the last framework you'll ever need to learn to answer any behavioral interview question, including the failure question. I've linked a longer video above so you can learn that framework yourself. I suggest watching that video after you finish this one. In any case, I will use that behavioral interview question framework today so you can see it in action as I teach you how to answer, "Tell me about a time when you failed." The first step in answering the failure question is to choose the failure you will present. The key here is to choose a failure that wasn't your fault. Make sure you choose a failure that wasn't caused by your poor planning, your bad judgment, or your lack of abilities. The reason why you should avoid these types of failures is pretty obvious. Imagine you're the interviewer. Put yourself in my shoes. If you give me an example that was your fault, I am caused to question your planning, your judgment, or your abilities. This is not something you want during a job interview. And look, we've all failed many different times, so don't put yourself in a position where you have to choose the worst possible example. Pick another failure. I'm sure you have many, and so do I. Okay, so when you select your failure, try to pick a failure that was caused by external circumstances. For most of us, whether we're individual contributors, low-level managers, or mid-level managers, anything that has to do with the business direction is usually outside of our control, and these are perfect examples to use for the failure question. So for example, if your business is bought, if your company changes its processes, its approach, its business strategy, and that causes your project to get deprioritized or under-resourced, that is a perfect reason for a failure. If you use an example like this, you're able to demonstrate your leadership, your ability to question with respect, your ability to collaborate to find a new solution, your ability to problem solve, your resilience. These are perfect examples. If you're not able to think of a failure that was caused by a business reason, and or if you're like in the C-suite, a senior leader, and there's really nothing outside of your control, try to pick something that's more like a black swan event. So these can be things like the pandemic itself, which caused a lot of havoc in our business approaches and our abilities to get things done. Also, the supply chain crisis that's happening in 2021 is another black swan event that may qualify. So the key here is to pick something that is not within your control, abilities, or planning or judgment, and then to demonstrate how you overcame that failure. When it comes to picking failures that are bad examples, you're going to have to think about examples that are going to call into question your judgment, your planning, or your abilities. So for example, if you're a product manager and your product fails to meet user needs, you have failed at your job. You don't want to give an example like this. If you're a project manager and your project fails because you didn't scope the work well enough, that calls into question your planning and abilities. You don't want to use an example like that. If you are a venture capitalist and you make an investment decision that pans out really poorly, that's going to call into question your judgment. You don't want to use that as an example. So hopefully this gives you an idea of example types to avoid, and you can think about how this applies to your role and the types of jobs that you're applying for. Okay, so now I'm going to illustrate this framework in action by answering a failure question from my own career. The question is, tell me about a time when you failed to meet an important objective. I was working at Target and we were preparing for Black Friday sales. Our entire team was in a time crunch to ensure that all of our end caps, which are the most prominent displays in the store, were full of items that were on sale for Black Friday. This meant that each of us was responsible for changing the signage, the shelving, the backboard, and the inventory for up to hundreds of items in our sections, and we only had a couple of hours before closing. I worked in electronics, which is a hot spot for Black Friday deals, so I had about 2 hours to change out over 200 items, signage, price tags, and inventory. Things were going pretty well until I got to my last item, which was a flat screen TV, and while the system said that we had dozens in inventory, I couldn't find them anywhere in the store or in our warehouse. The clock was ticking and I only had about 15 minutes before closing. All of my coworkers were quite busy with their own tasks, and they couldn't really help me locate the missing inventory. I looked everywhere, but with only 15 minutes left, I made a decision to stock a different item that wasn't actually on Black Friday sale, but was actually a useful accessory to some of the big ticket items that I thought would sell fast that were right next to it. By the time the shift was over, my section looked perfect. All of the signs, inventory, and end caps were full of items and ready for the Black Friday crowds. When we opened for Black Friday, the sale items had sold out entirely by midday, and about half of the full-priced accessory items that I had put on the end cap had sold too. It actually helped to have one end cap that had some stock of items so that my department in electronics didn't look barren while I was replacing all of the other end caps with items we had in stock. Customers later in the day even remarked that our store looked far less ravaged than other stores they had visited. I later found out that the inventory system had been incorrect. We never had any of the flat screen TVs that were showing up as in stock, so it turned out to be quite critical that I made the decision to stock the shelves. This experience taught me the importance of being able to get creative and get confident about making the best available decision. The fact that we sold half of the full-priced items that I had put on display told me that I had made the best decision given the situation. But I also wish that I had made the decision to give up on searching just a few minutes earlier so that I would have had time to pick out a few different full-priced accessories to put on display. I often wonder if I could have sold more like 75% of the items I had put on that end cap. Since that time in my career, I've taken on roles and assignments with much larger responsibilities and more significant consequences if things go wrong. I've been able to lean into those exact same problem-solving skills, seeking counsel when I can find it, when it's appropriate, and then making decisions as needed to keep moving forward. A quick example of this was at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. I needed to move my entire engineering team of about 200 people to work from home overnight. To give some context, we had always been co-located, and we were insistent that people work together in the office every day. So there was no clear answer, there was no right answer, but I went ahead and made the decision to let people work from home, and then I asked each team to schedule a daily stand-up call, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, just to check in with each team member. This allowed them to feel connected to the team and also gave them the opportunity to discuss not just their work, but what was happening in our world. That decision turned out to be the best decision I could have made for my team. The team productivity stayed the same or better as we were going through one of the most unprecedented moments in our history as a people. Okay, let's talk about what I did there. You notice that I picked a failure that was caused by something outside of my control, the inventory system being incorrect about the number of Black Friday flat screens we had in stock. You hopefully also noticed how I quantified the solution, noting that we only had 2 hours and I had to stock hundreds of items, and even that 50% of the full price items that I stocked had sold by midday. You almost certainly noticed that I used a structured way to answer the question, starting with the situation, then telling you what I did to solve the problem. I shared the results of that effort, and then I shared what I learned and how I've evolved and grown as a result. This is why structure matters. The way that I explained this in a logical and linear fashion allowed you to follow along with what I was saying and to understand every aspect of what I was conveying to you. I hope that you felt from my answer that it's pretty impressive to hear someone reflect on their accomplishment and then go on to explain how they would improve upon an effort that was already successful, like when I talked about how I wish that I had stopped looking for the inventory sooner and actually stocked the shelves with a variety of accessories so I could sell maybe 75% instead of the 50% that I had sold. This is really the secret sauce of my behavioral question answer framework. If you follow my framework, you should spend about the same amount of time answering the basics of the question, the star part, what happened, what you did, what were the results, as you spend talking about what you learned, what you do differently, and how you've grown and evolved over time. As a company, I always want to hire people who want to get better every day. As a hiring manager, I pick those people every single time over other candidates. So use this framework and get hired. Okay, so by popular demand, I'm going to give a bad example. And this is here so that you can see what it's like when someone does everything wrong. So I told you the 3 keys are be specific and give details, to quantify as much as possible, and to use the structure that I'm teaching you. I also told you that you need to pick a failure that doesn't call into question your planning, your judgment, or your abilities. I'm going to break all of those rules in this example so that you can see the difference between a good example and a bad one. But please, kids, do not try this at home. Do not do this bad example in your interviews. Okay, so the question I'm asking myself is, tell me about a time when you failed to meet an important objective. Great, so I'll tell you about a time when I was leading a project and we didn't finish the project on time. So I was working as a project manager for a company that made software products for clients. And my job was to scope the project and then to manage the deliveries and manage the client through the process. The problem with our project was that it had been actually scoped by another project manager that didn't know much about software. So I kind of inherited this poorly planned project, and it was my job to kind of get it back on track. But I didn't really know that when I took the project. So I had this project that was kind of doomed to begin with. And unfortunately, there's only so much you can do when you inherit something that's in a bad spot. So I tried really hard to rescope things. I went back to all the customer requests and tried to understand, could we deprioritize some of the things that they had asked for? And I worked with the engineers to make decisions about which scope we were going to work on later after the initial launch. Not throw overboard entirely, but get rid of it for now and then come back to it later. The problem was I made some bad decisions there, unfortunately. I didn't have a good relationship with the client because I hadn't done the initial scoping work. And so I didn't have a very nuanced view into what they really wanted. And so some of the things that I decided to deprioritize were actually pretty important to the customer. I didn't realize this until we launched, and the customer was really unhappy. They felt like we hadn't listened to them and we hadn't prioritized the features that they really wanted, and they didn't think that they were getting what they wanted, even though my team and I had worked so hard to get this thing over the finish line and get it to them on time. So it was a really painful experience, and as a result, I was taken off the project, and my manager started to give me smaller and smaller projects so that I could kind of recover and prove again that I was capable of managing such important projects for the company. But all in all, it was a pretty difficult experience, and I probably wouldn't want to do it again if I'm totally honest. Okay, so let's talk about what went wrong there. So first, obviously the example that I picked was a poor example because it reflected very poorly on my judgment, my planning, and my abilities, all three. I showed that I made decisions when it came to planning and execution that were questionable. I showed that I made bad judgment calls in terms of the scope that I had thrown overboard. And I showed that my abilities to communicate with the client were quite lacking. The second thing that went wrong is my answer was far more unstructured this time than the target example. And that lack of conciseness, if you're on the other end listening, you kind of lose the thread. And even though you're like, oh man, this is totally terrible and kind of funny to listen to, you're not as engaged as you are when someone gives a nice, crisp, structured answer. And then perhaps the worst part of my answer is that I didn't talk about what I learned or what I do differently. I didn't demonstrate that I wanted to get better after experiencing this. I said, I wouldn't really want to do that again. But I didn't actually express what I would do differently and how I've changed and evolved. And an ideal answer, I would have given an example of a later project that I took on that, yes, was smaller scope because I had been demoted, but that I absolutely landed, slam dunk. I communicated effectively, I scoped properly, I planned, I made good judgment calls. But because I didn't do that, the interviewer is left wondering, did she learn anything from this experience? You don't want that to happen to you. Okay, so congratulations. You now know a proven method for how to pick the right failure and how to answer the dreaded failure question in an interview. The next step for you is to think of a great failure example and practice it using the proven framework that I've demonstrated in this video. If you want a deeper dive into behavioral questions as a whole, please watch the video linked above, and you can find a lot of different interview videos on the Pocketboard channel. If you want me or other Pocketboard mentors to create more helpful mentoring tips and videos, please subscribe to this channel. To get new mentoring tips faster, make sure you ring the bell and you'll get notified when we publish new videos. Please drop a comment in this video to tell us what mentoring tips or skills you want us to cover in the next video. If you use any of this advice in your interviews, drop a comment, tell the community how it went. I'm Erika G., and you can find me on Pocketboard if you'd like one-on-one mentorship or coaching.